Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we've been looking at is The Master and His Emissary by Mcgilchrist, a book of enormous range and depth and erudition, whose ideas I've set out in 3 films, which I've called Science, Philosophy, History and Culture. And this is the third and final of these films, History and Culture, and I'm going to set out the ideas of this film in 5 sections, which I've called, firstly, Thesis Explained, secondly, The Ancient World, thirdly, Renaissance and Reformation, fourthly, Enlightenment and Romanticism, and fifthly, Industrial and Scientific Modernity, or The Master Betrayed. So kicking off with the first of these, Thesis Explained. And I'd say this is fairly straightforward, arguing that key moments in Western history and the impact that these have had can be understood, or better understood, through the lens of the brain and the evolving nature of its hemispheres. And this is what the second half of The Master and His Emissary seeks to demonstrate through a detailed survey of Western culture. But before we get to that, it's worth setting out how he came to formulate this proposition in the first place. And this can be done, I think, by the answers given to 4 questions. The first is, why the West? And in answering this, he begins with the recognition of the power and significance of other cultures, the cultures of Karl Jasper's Axial Age, of Buddha, Confucius, the Upanishads, and the Hebrew prophets, before going on to give 3 reasons for his focus on the West. And the first is simply because it's the West and its culture that he knows best. And secondly, the equally simple need to keep what is already an enormous book manageable. And thirdly, and the real reason I think, is because of what he sees as the significance, the range and the uniqueness of the cultural transformations in the West, which is, I hasten to say, not a claim for superiority. Indeed, central to his argument is that it's the unchecked acquisitive rationalism, scientific materialism, capitalism and bureaucracy, which first emerged in the West, which are the drivers of a hemispheric world out of balance, with potentially disastrous consequences for all that is human and across all cultures. The second question is, why the brain? And in answering this, he's also quick to point out that in any explanation of history and culture, it goes without saying that there are many factors at play in a matrix where no one element can be said to have caused all the others, with a multitude of social, economic, psychological and political factors, to name but a few, in dynamic interplay. But having said this, he goes on to claim that included in this complex interplay are the options made available to the human mind from its understanding of what the world is and what we need to do in order to survive and flourish in that world, which is to say, how we make sense of the world shapes how we act on that world. And relevant to this, it's also important to point out that our power to make sense of the world has been massively extended by the expansion of the frontal lobes of its 2 hemispheres some 400,000 years ago, leading to a massive leap in human capability and bringing what Mcgilchrist calls necessary distance, enabling us to stand back from the immediacy of the world, giving us both the space and the capability to decide then how we might act on that world. And the third question is, why the hemispheres, or more precisely, why the evolving nature of its hemispheres? And this is because it's not sufficient to simply say our brain shapes how we act on the world, because our survival requires that we simultaneously hold 2 very different and, as it turns out, incompatible ways of being in the world. In a sense, you could say that we need 2 brains, and in many ways that's what we have, except that we call them our hemispheres. And these not only have different ways of working, they also, according to Mcgilchrist, have diametrically opposed values and interests, which is why they evolved to be largely kept apart and independent of each other. So that when Mcgilchrist speaks of the enhanced power of expanded lobes, he's speaking of power given equally to hemispheres as rivals in potential conflict. And when he argues that Western history and culture might be better understood through the lens of the brain and the evolving nature of its hemispheres, part of what he's referring to is which, if any, of these two likely competitor hemispheres might be seen, as it were, in the driving seat of human development. Because given they have diametrically opposed worldviews, any culture either one might create would look very different if created by the other. That said, for most of human history, this has not been a problem, because for the vast majority of those 400,000 years of hemispheric development, the relationship between the two has been one of balanced and creative tension, managed by the brain itself through the corpus callosum, which at one point in the book Mcgilchrist refers to as the brain's Berlin Wall, because although physically it connects the hemispheres, operationally its main effect is to allow one hemisphere to inhibit the other, allowing each to expand its power despite pulling in opposite directions. As Mcgilchrist, speaking in the context of the ancient world, puts it, initially, this led to a period of unparalleled richness in Greek culture, when the left and right hemispheres worked in harmony, when, in Nietzsche's terms, there was a union of Apollo with Dionysus. This was marked not by some sort of compromise, but on the contrary, by going further than had ever gone before in both directions. So here then was a tension of mutual benefit, where a move forward in one hemisphere released a move forward in the other, stimulating and provoking each other to give birth each to new and more vigorous offspring, where the Apollonian left hemisphere and the Dionysian right incited themselves into continued development. But sadly, this arrangement of mutual benefit was not to last, so that Mcgilchrist tells us it's in the same Greek culture that we see the start point for what he maintains is an evolving struggle for power played out in the unfolding of Western civilization, whose trajectory was a slow but inexorable shift in the balance of power away from the right hemisphere and towards the left. And this is exactly what he seeks to demonstrate in the second half of The Master and His Emissary. Though, if we are to understand this properly, it's important to say that initially this is a story without immediate outcome or outright victor. Rather, the creative tension between the hemispheres persisted, but became progressively less stable and increasingly expressed in swings and cultural shifts, pendulating between those expressive of the left hemisphere, only to be followed by a corrective return to those animated by the values of the right, as a kind of balanced equilibrium where left hemisphere advance, expressed in cultures geared to mastery and emphasizing theory over experience, were followed by right hemisphere countercultures of connection, empathy, embodiment, and nature. But of course, ultimately, this is the story of the victorious left hemisphere, driven in its bid for power by absolute confidence and unassailable belief, and where the corrective swing of the pendulum increasingly took place on ground shifting ever more towards a left hemispheric world. And finally, there is the fourth and final question: what made all of this possible? Or put differently, what is the mechanism of transmission that translated the contested values and worldviews of these two hemispheres into distinct and alternating forms of culture and civilization? And addressing this, he begins with the recognition that the history of ideas and his account of those ideas cannot be understood in terms of natural selection, because natural selection works over infinitely greater stretches of time than the relatively tiny timescales of human civilization. But despite this, there are, he claims, two other mechanisms of transmission at play here, connecting the brain and the preferences of its hemispheres to the history and culture of the world in the making. And the first of these is a process called epigenetics, which is a relatively new discovery rapidly transforming our understanding of genetics, and central to the arguments of two previous books I've covered, namely The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk and The Science Delusion by Rupert Sheldrake, all of which argue that life events and even cultural traits can be passed across generations without altering our genetic DNA, made possible by the triggering of biochemical messages that do not change but effectively turn either on or off selected segments of our gene sequence, influencing what is expressed by our DNA without altering its overall structure, allowing in this case for a complex interplay between genetic evolution and cultural innovation. And the second instrument of transmission is imitation, or what Mcgilchrist calls mimesis, which is a hardwired right hemispheric drive to imaginatively enter into the world of another, allowing us to escape from the confines of our own experience and enter directly into a different mental world, in the way, for instance, that trackers in cultures dependent on hunting learn to get inside the animal, seeing it as if experiencing it. And this is what's going on, he thinks, in Dawkins' idea of memes, where ideas spread by contagion and cultural beliefs transmit from one mind to another. So these then are the grounds upon which Mcgilchrist came to formulate his thesis. And having set these out, we can now turn to his survey of Western culture as the battleground for the struggle for power between the hemispheres, with each cultural shift a marker for the slow but inexorable rise of the left hemisphere, beginning with its start point and taking us to part 2 in the ancient world of classical Greece and Rome. And it's with the Greeks where we can first see that process, whereby the enhanced power and capacity of both hemispheres to stand back from the world translates into culture, and in the case of Greece, into the explosion of its civilization. And as already suggested, this is an achievement of both hemispheres in balanced equilibrium across an astonishing range of cultural activity and in the service of both art and science. And in discussing this, as in all his discussions across each of the cultural movements that make up his survey, Mcgilchrist is very expansive, but he does tend to emphasise key areas of achievement, and in my account I'll stick to these, beginning here with, in ancient Greece, the achievements of the right hemisphere, of which he pays particular attention to 3. The first of these is its sculpture and portraiture, and especially the depiction of the human face, which Mcgilchrist describes as the unrivaled instrument of emotional communication and the unchallenged domain of the right hemisphere, telling us that prior to the Greeks there were virtually no faces in prehistoric art, and those that did exist were expressionless, schematic and forward-facing. But beginning from the 6th and especially from the 4th century BCE, there's a dramatic change, away from the inexpressive gaze of Egyptian and the earliest Greek representations, towards individualized, varied, emotionally expressive and empathetic depictions, faithful to the subtleties of expression and increasingly depicted towards the viewer's left, and therefore to the right hemispheric field of vision, channeling our emotion and our empathy. But it's in his second emphasis, drama, that we see the full power of the newly enhanced right hemisphere coming into its own, though it has to be said, not without the help of the left, whereby their dramatists could stand back and, left hemisphere-like, objectify the thoughts and feelings of others, only to return them back to their audience as their own, in a kind of empathetic transformation, where the feelings of others become recognised as our feelings. And perhaps this is the perfect example of how the balanced and creative tension between the hemispheres, in Nietzsche's terms, between the clear light of Apollo and the dense emotion of Dionysus, when used together, are of such great power and service. And for Mcgilchrist, the perfection of drama and the full realisation of all its potential comes with the birth of tragedy. And in Aeschylus's great play, Prometheus Bound, he sees not only the greatest of all tragedies, but the very essence and epitome of its form, seeing in the story of Prometheus, god of intelligence, who stole the fire from heaven, gave it to mortals, taught them to think, and who was punished in the most gruesome and unforgettable way, seeing in this his own account of the hubris of reason and even the mind coming to know itself. As he puts it, Aeschylus's description of the fate of Prometheus is profoundly moving, yet also recounts the pain that comes on man from his hubristic attempt to seize that which belongs to another realm to make himself powerful, and even seems to me to be the mind coming to know itself without knowing it. And finally, in his third emphasis, the beginnings of philosophy, Gilchrist sees how philosophy, which was to become synonymous with the left hemisphere as a hyper-conscious process of abstract and disembodied thinking, he sees that it did not begin this way, instead first emerged with the pre-Socratics, not driven by the left hemisphere instinct for control, but from a right hemispheric sense of wonder, looking to understand not the internal human mind, but nature, and who, in Heraclitus, articulated the right hemispheric conception of reality, understanding the hidden and implicit nature of a world made from the union of opposites, forever in process, and where all things flow. But, of course, these great achievements of the right hemispheric mind were everywhere matched by those of the left, which, especially through Aristotle, invented, refined and formalised systematic bodies of knowledge across a bewildering range, including history, physics, biology and politics. But for Mcgilchrist, perhaps its greatest, albeit regrettable, achievement was to produce the left hemisphere's greatest ever philosopher in the form of Plato, who, along with his mentor Socrates, transformed it from the right hemispheric endeavour just described into the trademark disembodied discipline of left hemisphere thinking. And with the exception of Descartes, no other philosopher did so much to banish the body from Western culture. Prior to Plato, body and soul were woven together in the Greek imagination, so that in Homer the thoughts and the consciousness of his protagonists were, Mcgilchrist argues, inseparable from the movement and metabolism of the body. But with Plato, the soul became the mind and the mind became reason, no longer part of the body, but instead its prisoner. And whilst the body was the earthly realm of degraded appetite, the soul mind was the one and only source of truth, whose theoretical knowledge, Plato argued, was a reality beyond the illusions of the physical world, producing perfect, timeless and universal ideas that he called the forms, and which in his view were more real than the physical and concrete objects of the world. So here then, in ancient Greek culture, we find the expression and achievement of both hemispheres, much of which was the product of that creative tension between them. But if its overall culture was the outcome of balanced equilibrium, it was, like its philosophy, a culture already leaning toward the left. And of course, this is a tendency that will characterize the rest of Western culture. And as we move to the Roman world, this becomes still more visible. Yes, we see in its civilization not only the appearance but also the development of right-inspired artistic forms, especially in the early years, in the poetry and literature of Virgil, Horace and Ovid, as well as the skill and sensitivity of its portraiture and sculpture. But alongside these great achievements, built as they were on the cooperation of both hemispheres, Roman civilization moves ever more towards systemized ways of thinking, which was in many ways an inevitable symptom of its growing empire, where architecture increasingly becomes the uniform celebration of power, and its sculptured portraits revert to the abstract and distant gaze of the pre-Greek world. And even Christianity, once the most powerful mythos of the incarnate and embodied world, becomes integrated into the state and ever more steeped in dogma. So this then is the first expression of the new power of both hemispheres, as well as the creative and balancing tension between them, expressed as different moments within the same broad cultural expression. But after the ancient world, and as we move towards the modern, the hemispheric struggle for power begins much more to oscillate in alternating cultural shifts that may be seen as couplets of opposition, not necessarily as a conscious reaction to each other, but more near simultaneous bursts in opposite directions. And the first of these comes with the Renaissance and Reformation, bringing us to part 3. And here, Mcgilchrist describes the Renaissance, although highly informed by science and mathematical principles, as the next great insurgence of the right hemisphere, which he discusses in a more diffuse way, touching on a broader range of features, including a new emphasis on originality and individuality, when for the first time the artist becomes a kind of hero, personified in the figures of Leonardo and Michelangelo, at one with God, possessed of magic powers, and a conduit for divine inspiration. There's also a return to perspective, especially depth. This had been understood by the Greeks, but lost for over 1,000 years, and was now once again powerfully invoked. Not only the depth of space, but now also of time, not least because the source of Renaissance inspiration was its conscious turning back to the ancient world, and in so doing, seeing itself as situated in time and part of the continuous and changing stream of culture. And then, of course, there's its celebration of beauty, the beauty of the world and all that's in it, leaving behind what Mcgilchrist calls the medieval world picture, which saw the splendour of nature as something to be resisted and treated as a snare, but was now evoked in colour and metaphor, melody and harmony, celebrating life and restoring our earthly and embodied sense of existence. Closely related to this was a newfound delicacy of feeling, of love and longing, melancholy and the transience of everything beautiful and good, expressed in music and poetry, troubadour songs, madrigals, requiems and great devotional works, singing and playing of all that is rich in life, but also of its shadow in death, whose standout emblem, the skull, was so dramatically depicted in Holbein's The Ambassadors. And finally, there was the human body, which the right hemisphere recognises as its home and connector to the world, and was the endless fascination of the metaphysical poets as something to love rather than denigrate. And drawing from classical Greece, from Giotto onwards, came a new preoccupation with the expressive powers of the human face, right hemisphere favouring profiles in portraiture, and in depictions, Mcgilchrist tells us, where the entire left side of the body took on, in his words, a cast of beauty, truthfulness and fragility. And if the tragedy of Aeschylus and the philosophy of Heraclitus embody the right hemispheric culture of the ancient world, then Shakespeare's disregard for theory and category, celebration of multiplicity and human variety, and his confounding of genres make him the embodiment of the right hemispheric Renaissance, whose flawed and contradictory characters played out their lives in a web as a mingled yarn of good and ill. And if the Renaissance was an insurgence of the right, then the Reformation is its revolutionary other, an alternate insurgency from the left, which ironically begins like philosophy as driven initially by the instincts and concerns of the right hemisphere, only to become annexed by the agenda of the left. In this case, it begins with Luther's concern to move away from corrupt church authority and empty expressions of faith towards religious authenticity, and the authentically real is again very much the province of the right hemisphere. But in the Reformation, this quickly becomes mistaken, misunderstood, and manipulated to unleash forces of destruction in what became a left hemispheric crusade for certainty and singular truth. So that, fearing the power of imagination and unable to accept the ambiguous or metaphorical, its enemy became not just the established church, but also the visual image, which for Mcgilchrist is the right hemisphere's most potent messenger of myth and metaphor, but which in the Reformation became an object of terror, so that on the heels of the greatest outpouring of religious art in human history came the iconoclasm of the Reformation, with paintings once a medium for divine mystery abolished, destroyed, washed over or defaced, to be increasingly replaced by the written word, which is to say, by the left hemisphere's most potent messenger for certainty. And true to the left hemisphere preference for a system of virtual signs over reality itself, words acquired the status of things, reproduced endlessly in countless inscriptions such as "I am the way" or "This is the Lamb," to become ultimately and ironically objectified, becoming themselves frozen idols of ritualized worship, repeated endlessly to drum its listeners ever more into the realms of the left hemisphere. And like capitalism, Protestantism lionizes individual agency, discounting what might be called communion and emphasizing instead self-assertion, which in a supreme irony dispensed with the sacred, eroded the power of the church and buttressed the state, with the church becoming an instrument of control in a new culture of control, where altar gave way to pulpit and God's love mutated to become God's punishment, and what began as a revolt against empty structures became the instrument for structure of the clear, certain and explicit singular truth over the ambiguous, multiple and fluid mysteries of the early church. But if the Reformation was alternate insurgency to the exuberance of the Renaissance, its narrow intensity could not sustain a left hemisphere culture over the longer term, and it's not until the next couplet of opposition that a much more potent challenge would bring the values and worldview of the left hemisphere close to realization, but still not quite free from a final bid by the right hemisphere to retain influence over the world in the making. Which brings us to part 4, Enlightenment and Romanticism. And of course, the Enlightenment stands alongside ancient Greece as the second pillar to Western civilization and self-identity. And because it's principally a movement of philosophy, you would have thought that its secular spirit should distinguish it from the religious fundamentalism of the Reformation. But for Mcgilchrist, and very much at odds with its celebrated status in the Western mind, Rather than an opening of the mind, in many ways it represents a closing in of intellectual horizons and a narrowing of the self. Indeed, in its more ardent expressions, he sees parallels with its insurgent left hemisphere predecessor, displaying the same banishment of wonder, triumph of the explicit, mistrust of nature, and alienation from the embodied world, where Renaissance multiplicity and ambiguity give way to singularity and single-minded clarity of vision, and in his rejection of what he sees as Enlightenment hubris, he has two main lines of critique. The first is its move from reason to rationality. And this is something I dealt with at some length in the previous film, so my comments here will be brief. Suffice to say that for Mcgilchrist, reason and rationality are two very different types of mental processes, which he argues correspond to the two very different concerns of the hemispheres, where reason might be seen as the global, all-encompassing intelligence of the right hemisphere, whereas rationality is the narrower and more abstract procedural intelligence of the left. The former, reason, respects the implicit, the ambiguous, and the unresolved, while the latter, rationality, seeks explicit clarity by imposing fixed certainty to the complexities of life. And the second is what he sees as the Enlightenment contempt for nature, the body, culture, and the past, where nature is no longer the living source of beauty and wonder, but something to be transcended, tamed, and made use of, and where Cartesian dualism completes the Platonic derision of the body, emphasizing the intellect as the defining feature of humanity, and in the process discounting the wisdom of culture, poetry, drama, painting, and religious ritual, as well as banishing the emotional and even the reality of death. All of which, for Mcgilchrist, is personified in the figure of Jeremy Bentham, father of pleasure-based utilitarianism and the all-capturing eye of the panopticon, and who referred to his morning walks as anti-genticular circumgyrations, and for whom J.S. Mill noted he knew so little of human feelings. And despite noble exceptions, such as the playful, beautiful and moving music of Mozart, or the generous and non-dogmatic poetry of Dryden and Pope, Mcgilchrist sums up the character of Enlightenment art as something of an oxymoron, while in his view, Enlightenment politics was a fruitless and destructive exercise in the fantasy that French conceptions of liberty, equality and fraternity could be delivered by guillotine, and the American pursuit of happiness by a rationalist constitution, and that any kind of good society, or for that matter anything valuable, can simply be willed into existence. And in an explicit and conscious reaction against all of this came Romanticism, the last great corrective expression for the values and worldview of the right hemisphere, emerging in Gilchrist's account from the cracks in the edifice of Enlightenment hubris, in the words of Mcgilchrist, to redress the imbalance of the hemispheres and to curtail the domination of the left. And like the Renaissance before it, in the hands of Montaigne, Erasmus, Spinoza, Blake, Goethe and Keats, it marked a return to the classical world, its beautiful sculpture and seductive warmth, and sought to remove the worst and take the best of Enlightenment values, but most of all to return what the Enlightenment had banished, retreating from self-consciousness, reconnecting the mind with the body, reanimating feeling, longing, melancholy, empathy, and a passion for the living world, returning theory to experience, renewing the power of metaphor, and recognising what Heraclitus had seen all those centuries ago, that our world is never complete and always in flux, which, taken together for Mcgilchrist, represents a widening in the field of engagement beyond the restrictive and narrow range of theory, engaging with the world not as an idea but as incarnate reality. And we can see this, he tells us, in its paintings and feel it in its poetry, in his words, wooing by whatever means can be brought to bear the world as delivered by the right hemisphere. And in his survey of its art, he emphasises two great achievements. The first is a return to depth, expressed not only in place and time, but also in light, in depictions of nature and of the classical world, and portrayed in painting and poetry, not in the bright glare of Enlightenment clarity, but in the haunting half-light of dawn and dusk, and of hidden paths and unlit places, of dreams, the unconscious and the implicit, all of which was perfected in the turbulent lightscapes of its great painter of light, Turner. And the second comes with the idea of the sublime, invoked in the portrayal of vast distances of visual depth and metaphoric power, working to capture a kind of immensity, not to dwarf, but to expand one's being, to unite us with something greater in an experience of soul-expanding awe. And for Mcgilchrist, much of which is expressed in the very fabric of Wordsworth's poetry, with its unself-conscious union of subject and object, of an incarnate world penetrating our physical frame, our breathing and our pulse, conjuring empathetic connection to living and breathing nature. And of course, Wordsworth and the Romantics are still with us, but sadly the culture has moved on, and we know how this story is going to end. And taking us there is our final section, Section 5, Industrial and Scientific Modernity, or as Mcgilchrist puts it, the master betrayed. Because here is the true turning point, and the moment when the left hemisphere finally seems to have got there and made the world in its own image, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, which Mcgilchrist describes as the left hemisphere's most audacious and daring assault on the world of the right hemisphere, and man's most brazen bid for power over nature, slicing its way through the landscape and sweeping away cultural history to create a replica of life constructed from identical entities, rectangular, reproducible, mechanistic and man-made, and where through technology the structures of the left hemisphere and its simulated theoretical world have become themselves incarnate and made real. And crucial to this project is scientific materialism, which Mcgilchrist calls the Second Reformation, for its literalism, contempt for imagination and desperation for certainty, replacing the authority of God with the new divinity of science, and which in the early years of the 19th century declared itself Plato-like as the highest form of knowledge, enabling it to criticise all other accounts of the world while rendering itself immune to criticism, extending itself throughout the whole of life. And between them, these implacable forces, industrial and scientific materialism, have become the shock troops of modernity, forces of rapid transformation and dislocation, where industrialization, science, bureaucracy, capitalism, consumerism and the modern state have dismantled and disenchanted a world of felt connection and cultural continuity, ushering in an era of fractured identity, anomie and existential angst, where abstract, technical and bureaucratic ways of thinking are rapidly destroying what Mcgilchrist calls the sacred canopy of collective belief, emptying life of meaning in a world where real things and experiences are being replaced by symbolic tokens. And drawing on the work of Louis Sass, Mcgilchrist argues that under modernity, abstraction and detachment from the world, our bodies and communities are producing a pathological type of seeing and experiencing, arguing this is what happens when we're no longer connected to the coherence-giving context of the lived world, becoming passive, disengaged, excessively self-conscious and narrowly focused in a world that is increasingly alien and frightening, which is to say, our society begins to resemble the mental world of the schizophrenic. And the culture that this produces is one of detachment, fragmentation, irony, disengagement and mockery, a condition which, according to Susan Sontag, is positively invited by modernist art, where cubism, minimalism, absurdism and surrealism offer dislocated abstractions and rectilinear shapes of disjunction and random juxtaposition, where art no longer points to anything beyond itself, no higher values or mystery of being, just consciousness watching itself, severed from any meaning in shared values and experiences, and where things are replaced by concepts and concepts become things. Of course, as in previous cultural moments, Mcgilchrist reminds us that not all is lost to left hemisphere abstraction, and right-inspired culture continues to bring meaning and beauty even within the modernist landscape, as with the painting of Egon Schiele or Marc Chagall, the music of Benjamin Britten or Arvo Pärt, or the cinematic poetry of Tarkovsky. But despite this, he tells us that the overall thrust is towards a culture of soul sickness, lionizing the future, scornful of the past, and intoxicated by power, admiring what is precisely powerful rather than beautiful, as was demonstrated so painfully in the genocides of the great modernist political movements, fascism, Nazism and communism. And more recently, as modernism has given way to postmodernism, the principle of power is still with us, but has morphed from the monolithic structures of centralized command into the power of surveillance, CCTV, and panoptical control, while art has become a game of codes and cleverness, where all that might yield meaning has been ironized out of existence, and where the emptiness of a wholly insubstantial world speaks of its own vacuity, as Mcgilchrist puts it, separating words from their reference in the real world as postmodernism does, turns everything into a nothing, life itself into a game. And all of these processes and transformations from the Industrial Revolution onward have for Mcgilchrist increasingly cultivated a culture and a society of cumulative illness, so that schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder, autism and Asperger's all reflect our fragmented existence stripped of meaning, while embodied being is attacked by increasing levels of self-harm and conditions such as anorexia, and where an epidemic of boredom is fueled rather than sated by the gross stimulation and crude sensationalism of modern culture. So this then concludes Ian Mcgilchrist's survey of the divided brain and the making of the Western world, a world increasingly under the sway of the left hemisphere. It's a bleak picture, but he concludes with reasons for hope, though, much like Dugald Hine in his book At Work in the Ruins, this is a kind of hope beyond hope, a hope birthed in uncertainty. But surely the description he gives and the warning this contains is ever more validated by our ever more virtual world.